Kokina semdol kake mofaseda.
Welcome to Talking in Stations, a podcast about EVE Online. Today, we are happy to welcome Hilmar back to the program. How's it going, Hilmar?
It's going great. Great to be back.
And with him, we have CCP Falcon.
Hey, man. Good to be here.
And CCP Goodfella, who's new to CCP, if I'm not mistaken.
I've been here for 2.5 years, but I'm at least new to Talking in Stations. Thank you for having me.
In EVE Online, that is definitely a new bro.
True.
But it's nice to meet you for the first time.
Likewise.
So for Talking in Stations, we have Carneros.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
Elise Randolph.
Hey, how's it going?
And off screen, we have Caleb Aranya.
Hey, guys.
All right. So the last time that we talked with you, Hilmar, it was just before the Invasion tour and also expansion. And that was about March, the end of March. And since then, a lot of things have happened. And we'll just start with the most present one, which is the blackout in nullsec. So it's been 13 days since nullsec has been blacked out. And we're wondering if the players have surprised you with some of their behavior.
So I think sort of based on my own experience of playing through wormhole gameplay quite a bit last year, and the prototype of the blackout when we had the broken chat system of last year, that we had enough data to extrapolate from what would happen. And I would just say what we estimated would happen actually happened just to a greater extent than we estimated, which is usually often what happens with EVE. We think something will have a small effect to some direction, and it just has had a massive effect to a similar direction, but just much higher amplitude. It's definitely driven up activity across the board. Some people were worried that this would most make everyone crab up and nobody would do anything. That has not been the case. We're actually experiencing right now, this month of July, we have the highest MAU and DAU in the past 5 years, just to give you a sense. So if I just look across our metrics, EVE Online has not been as vibrant over the summer in the past 5 years.
Can I just chime in and say MAU is monthly active users and DAU is daily active users? These are two key statistics across games. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Carneros.
And I mean, it has also created so much discussion. Falcon, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time that we've broken our forum thread.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize that limit was there, but our forum software discourse actually has a hard limit of 10,000 posts per thread, and there was that much, let's say, quote unquote discussion going on the forums that we actually filled the thread and had to open a second one. So it's kept people pretty active. The response has obviously been really polarized, and there's some people who love it, some people who hate it, and some people who just don't care because they don't really interact with nullsec. But we've definitely seen some interesting metrics, and it's pretty interesting to see how things have changed over the course of the last 13 days.
That's amazing. I remember the first time I hit a stack limit for Tritanium. I had no idea there would be a stack limit. I was shocked. Yeah, I can imagine that would be a surprise. No, excellent. Are there... Now you're seeing more people logging in and more people playing. Is there a part of the activity of the game that's really surprised you about the change, either up or down? Is like, for example, did PvE behave like you thought it would?
Well, I mean, there definitely has been like a change to it in various different directions. Like EVE today, 13 days in, is quite a different game than it was before. But it's just overall this increased amount of vibrancy, which I think relates both to the change itself, which is exciting. And it's aligned with goals we have set ourselves for this year, which I think I talked to some extent in March when I was here, is that overall we want to decrease the challenge for new players and we want to increase the challenge for veterans playing EVE Online. EVE Online has so many super smart players that to some extent the game has already been solved. The game was slowly turning into the purple donut everyone was fearing. And that is like the end game solution state of like the chaos of EVE Online has just been reined into order, and everyone is slowly reaching a consensus on how things should be. And that is a clear signal to us that we need to increase the challenge and we need to shake things up. And sort of with that challenge in mind, we walked into some of these things we've been doing over the summer and will continue to be doing, is that often we tend to overthink. We sometimes think we're so smart. We sit around the table and start to think through all the angles. And we've been taking a very different approach with these changes, is that we're going to do more, I call them experiments, but obviously these are calculated experiments, and they're a lot built on. We have a very clear direction on what we want to do. We want to increase the challenge for veterans, decrease the challenge for new players, and we have such more robust data infrastructure so that it's much easier for us to do experiments which are quote unquote not fully thought through, and then track the changes and then come up with a hypothesis built on that. When you have such a complicated system like EVE, which is so anthropologic, economical, socio-economical, I mean, there are so many variants, nobody is smart enough to think through all the angles. So we often get lost in our own thinking about it because we have so much access to what's going on that we feel like we should be able to. But I've frankly just given up on that line of thinking. It's just too slow. And to some extent, we've just been too slow because we are trying to do the perfect thing. And as I often say, excellence, perfection is the enemy of excellence. So I hope that you will see us do more like this, where we are making moves, we're making changes, we're tracking the progress. We have our overall hypothesis. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes something even more inspiring happens. Sometimes it doesn't work out, then we need to tweak it. So I am hoping the tone we've set over the summer, which, as some of you know, is like getting something done in Iceland in the summer, is a miracle. Everyone needs to go and take care of the sheep over the summer.
So they eat during the winter, right?
Yeah, exactly. We coat during the winter and take care of sheep during summer. It's basically Iceland for you. Then I hope once we get people back from vacation, you will see even more of that. And EVE Online will enter into a very exciting sort of chaos era after a fairly stable situation, which I think is turning into, as I sometimes say, our sandbox is turning into cement.
Okay, so chaos era.
One second. Before the chaos era, I just want to clear up that the purple donut is very interesting. I haven't heard that before. But that donut represents outlaw space, which circles empire space. So the donut hole is actually controlled empire space. The donut is the outside, that's lawless space, and that's where players kind of take over sovereignty. For those of you that don't understand what the donut references are, with either a blue donut or now a purple donut.
Yeah, did I say purple? I thought I said blue.
What did you guys hear? Anyway, I thought it was purple, and I thought that's brilliant. And of course, that's Hilmar, like fourth dimension thinking, because purple represents kill everybody outside your fleet. So it actually works the same way. If everybody's friends, you're killing everybody outside your friend circle.
Let's roll with that. It's also the color we've chosen for a product development model we introduced earlier in the year called the EVE Hierarchy of Needs, which starts with blue, purple, green, orange, and yellow. And it's kind of modeled after the Maslow Hierarchy of Needs. And the purple rim in the pyramid is called cruel but fair, which matches the safety analogy of the Maslow Hierarchy of Needs. But obviously there's no safety in EVE, so we call it cruel but fair. So in a way, we're going to be increasing cruelty Challenge is the more politically correct word, but I also like cruelty. EVE should be cruel but fair, and it's neither cruel or fair right now, and it needs a major adjustment.
Chaos era. We're coming out to a chaos era. We're 13 days into this blackout, and we feel like players still feel like they're experimenting with trying to find solutions to the state of what they are experiencing in EVE. And it still feels like there's more change coming. And I'm hearing the word experiments. Does it sound should we be expecting more experiments and more change coming to EVE?
Yes. If we do our job well, something should be changing every week. We want you on your toes. We want you to feel like the blanket is being pulled underneath you every single week. So you're panicking all the time. The heart rate goes up. You need to take stress medicine to keep focus. That is the chaos era, and it is on.
That's actually pretty nifty because at least in nullsec, a lot of the players, like the veteran players that you mentioned, and even some newer players that moved out there, it felt like the pendulum of like danger to safety has been like firmly in the direction of safety. And instead of letting it swing back gently, you guys just seem to be throwing it against the wall into the side of danger and chaos.
Yes, absolutely. If you've read the very good sci-fi book, Three Body Problem, written by a Chinese author, it's phenomenally good. Some of the best sci-fi I read in recent times. They talk about the Triglavians. They're actually not Triglavians, but the Trisolaris. I wonder where that comes from. Which live in a triple star system, and the triple star system once in a while aligns, and that introduces a chaos era to the Trisolarians, not the Triglavians. I need to sort this in my head. And there is a bit the inspiration. We're now entering a chaos era.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think from my point of view, coming up on being a 17-year vet of EVE, for the last sort of 3, 4, maybe 5 years, we've been in a position where Elise is entirely right. The pendulum has swung to the safety side of things, and it's just sort of stopped. And obviously, when I go down the avenue that I'm going, when I'm about to speak, I mean no disrespect to the guys who spend all the time doing the leadership and logistics side of things. But for me, I look at nullsec and I just see it as kind of a wasteland of people who've bedded in, and they're just happy in their little bubble, making a shitload of ISK, generally going about their day-to-day life in, quite frankly, conditions that in a lot of instances are a lot safer than Empire, because they have a big capital umbrella to sit under. They're very safe. They can, AFK mine, or they can AFK rat, or they can just sit in an asteroid belt and do what the hell they want all day. They have, people patrolling the space taking care of them. They have the ability to travel over large distances pretty quickly with the infrastructure that's been set up. And I just think that we need to be in a position where there's a lot more unpredictability thrown into things. That goes for nullsec and for lowsec as well. I really think we need to shake things up substantially and just rattle the cage and see who survives and who doesn't.
Falcon, you were in the Metasphere news recently with a post that you put on Reddit talking about some of the stuff that you would have envisioned. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you wrote and if you have any comments on it. Because it got a really good reception from a lot of players, it looked like.
Yeah, I actually earned 1.5 years of Reddit Premium out of that. I got upvoted and gilded that much. I was very surprised because I was actually talking to a couple of guys internally, and we were talking about things that we'd like to do to EVE, and a couple of the guys were like, "Wow, you're a lot more kind of hardcore thinking than the rest of us." And I kind of took that as a little bit of a badge of honor, because I mean, if it was up to me, EVE would be a horrible, harsh, dark, dystopian, nasty place where bad things happen, and I'd really try and keep people on their toes as much as possible. I mean, you know, and when I say that, you know, I mean no disrespect to the guys in dev. They've got a very hard job keeping the scales balanced in terms of keeping things running, and they're very busy doing a lot of good stuff for Eve. But yeah, I think to put it as I can't remember who said it, but if it was up to me, Eve would be an absolute hellscape of just horror and terribleness. So it's I'd very, very harshly shake things up.
Yeah, and obviously what is hard to do this is that when we sort of procedurally generated the puzzle that was EVE Online in the beginning, and not even us knew what the universe was like, it was made by a computer. One of the elements we did not fully factor in is something I call procedural regeneration. Is that the world as we built it was static because we never foresee we would be running the game for decades. Our wildest dreams was to run EVE Online for 5 years and then do something else. And now when we're 16 years in, we are limited a little bit by the sort of initial conditions of the game. So this kind of what ideally would be procedural regeneration, and hopefully we'll be able to build that in as we go. But given the state of the infrastructure, some of this needs to be done manually, and has to be done with a few kicks and a few sort of, as I call it, chaos error. But I wish once we kind of move through that, then we maybe reach another degree of stability. Whenever that happens, that we sort of empower EVE Online with the ability to procedurally regenerate itself. And there are various tools and technologies today you can do to achieve that. And then we will keep the game much more like nature on planet Earth, where there is an element of natural chaos built into the system. Even if at some point we might be able to calculate all the weather patterns, all the carbon dynamics, all the things that go into making our planet, but still we're a long ways off. So it's kept life interesting for what, 300,000 years that Homo sapiens has been here. So while it's going to be some of what we're doing now, it's manual tweaks, it's using tools we have, but more operated by humans than I would like to be. I hope at some point we end up in the state where EVE Online procedurally regenerates itself to the point where we are like freaked out about what's going on.
Just a small comment on that, because you're pointing back to early EVE history, and being a veteran myself, I was also around when all this was conceptualized and you put this into play, and it was pretty much what hooked a lot of us. Back then, we used to have a lot of training wheels. You put in a lot of training wheels in the form of NPC stuff to actually get the ecosystem started. Then you started rolling them back and removing them so we could pretty much run the whole ecosystem as player versus player. And I'm just wondering what went wrong, because it feels to me as if at some point you stopped trusting the simulation and kind of put in new training wheels, and we're suffering from this today. Are you thinking of removing those training wheels again and getting us back to being proper player versus player-centric ecosystems?
So I think there are parts of the game where people have too many training wheels, and there are parts of the game where people need more training wheels. There's a certain bifurcation to what we need to do. Interestingly enough, we have made the situation for new players coming into EVE in 2019 worse than ever. And it's worse than ever because the game has increased in complexity. So it's just more to learn, and there's, believe me, a lot more to learn. And also, frankly, our latest iteration on the MPE performs worse than what we had before. What we had before was pretty good, but it had a lot of technical issues. It was hard to maintain. It was very monolithic and hard to improve upon. So we needed to put in place a better system to iterate on. But right now, the content of the system needs improvement. So we have done the reverse of what we should have done. We've made the life for new players harder, and we've made the life of veterans easier. And
just a small correction. I was thinking of the ecosystem in the form of resources and resource gathering, not so much NPE stuff.
Yes. So the problem with the resource gathering goes back again into procedural regeneration, is that the algorithms behind the scene are fairly static. Fairly is probably even a compliment to them. And thus the landscape is not shifting underneath, and nothing behaves like that. I mean, when you're strip mining in nature, you ruin the earth beneath you. And I personally have always had this fantasy about, like, if you're strip mining, you have scorched earth, but if you're like manually mining in your little Ventru, then okay, then it's maybe environmentally safe. Which would then turn into offensive mining, where you would go and mine in your enemy's territory to ruin their territory, which again is what people do in war. Like, people go and burn cornfields, destroy infrastructure, etc. And EVE just doesn't have enough of that, because the mineral redistribution system is just too static, and it doesn't take input from the player action enough into account. Doing something like that would push EVE more into like the weather system on planet Earth, which would make it more naturally unpredictable. So to your point, we have kind of in a way made everyone self-sufficient. At some point, the mineral distribution was very asymmetric. So you had to build alliances across the board to get everything, to piece everything together. Then we made it symmetric, which was rather ridiculous, but whatever. Not everything you do is going to work out, and we need to not spool that back, but we need to sort of impugn EVE with its own ability to wreak chaos on some of these kind of fundamental input variables into what drives the rest of the economy.
Yeah, because fundamentally you brought in anomalies which flattened everything, and then you brought in moon mining, which was potentially the most unique invention ever in node respawn mechanics, but it doesn't really have the effect yet because the other one is still running.
Yes, you are correct.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at sort of when you look at the complexity of EVE over the years, I mean, Hilmar's entirely right. I can remember when I joined back in the day, and it was 4 classes of ships. It was frigate, cruiser, battleship, and industrial. That's what you had to choose from. 4 races. There was nothing you could fly that was pirate. There was no T2. But back then, I mean, there was also no tutorial. You got dumped into space in a rookie ship with a Concorde drone orbiting you in an asteroid belt, and you basically had to figure out how to kill the Concorde drone before it killed you. And that was basically the tutorial. It was, you know, there's a station, go on your way, young whippersnapper. And that was how things worked. And yeah, I mean, I totally agree that we've added so many systems in over the last 16 years that EVE has just become this sprawling web of games within games, effectively. I mean, you have PR, you have the soft system, you have, I mean, you could conceptually, you could think of ship fitting and ship simulation entirely as its own game. So there's so many different facets to EVE, and I do agree that we've made life way too easy for those players that already have the sort of the institutionalized, established knowledge, and we made it very difficult for new players to come into the game and actually to compete at the same level. So we definitely need to look at how we onboard people and how we bring in, and the numbers show that. But in terms of shaking things up, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'd love to see a situation where you know, we have diminishing depletable resources where, for instance, if you want to corner the Tech 2 market, you can't necessarily, you know, find an area of space and get everything you want from that area of space to be able to build T2 ships. You're going to need to trade. You're going to need to barter. You're going to need to deal with other people who hold other areas of space on the opposite side of the map in order to get everything you need to build a ship. I think it's natural that when you compare EVE to Earth, or you compare EVE to the wider solar system, that different resources are going to be located in different areas. Different people are going to have different grasps on things. And it really, really strengthens the economy, and it strengthens player-to-player interaction if you actually have the ability to rely on others to be able to get the job done. We
see what you're doing with we're trying to make things easier to onboard for new players. You've also got long-term players, people who've been around a long time. And you can break those players down into some that are more risk aversive, maybe more conservative, some that are more aggressive and willing to try new stuff and don't care if their ship blows up, or there are different personalities behind it. If New Eden is going to become a more dangerous place, if an era of chaos is coming to us, we're going to want to bring along some of the more conservative ones a bit and maybe coax them along the way so we don't scare them off immediately. Is this part of your plan too, or is it more part of like you're using some of the upcoming events to portray maybe some of the vision and get them on board that way, emotionally?
So, I mean, I actually thought a lot about this. Maybe it's just time to just let it slip into being a country for old men like myself. And maybe it's just time. And what actually gave me an interesting signal in that it wasn't time for that is, one is that we've been doing experiments on the customer acquisition side and marketing, and we have a tremendous amount of an ability to generate interest in the game. We are now up to about 16,000 people log in for the first time every week, which is a lot for a 16-year-old MMO. It's a lot.
It is.
And these are people that like go through the sign-up forum, download the launcher, download the download on demand, go and create a character, and God knows what. 16,000 people per week, new players. So that's one variable. Then the adoption rate of the 64-bit client surprised me. We got 40% of EVE players to adopt it as an optional beta with very sort of obscure concrete benefit, other than it really performs better in fleet fights and elements like that, which is maybe not the everyday activity for everyone all the time. But 40% of players that jump on something like this, which is new technology, indicates that we have a higher degree of innovators over kind of late adopters than I estimated to be the case at this point in time. So that gave me sort of a different way to think about it. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's not time. Maybe there is growth ahead of for EVE Online, and based on the influx, based on how the response has been to the relatively crazy things. I wouldn't call them crazy, but they're maybe crazy in line with what we usually do over the summer. And the response has been generally good, and both in terms of the anecdotal response, but also in terms of the data. So I just think we have a lot less conservative people than you might maybe think, given a game at this point in time. But I mean, obviously the main element is like EVE is designed like a difficulty mountain, which is a sort of a game design theory of like you just allow people to go up the difficulty mountain as high as you want to go, and then you just find your niche. So in a way, the difficulty mountain is broken. It doesn't go high enough and it doesn't go low enough. So it's about like metering out the difficulty curve in a different way, like reducing it for new players, mid-core players, and maybe some people also just want to chill out in EVE. I do a lot of that, believe me, like listening to science podcast, mining in HiSec, and doing Project Discovery. I sometimes do that on Sundays when my brain needs a break from life. So I mean, that's also fine, but I do that even though I've been playing EVE for 16 years. I just chill out in HiSec and do mildly idle mining with science podcasts and Project Discovery. I love it. And like I'm finding planets and listen to Neil DeGeris talk about something at the same time. So due to this sort of difficulty mountain design, it's more about like pulling off. Like, okay, we used to build Mount Everest as a difficult mountain. There is now a queue of people waiting to get to the top. Kind of that image is kind of the good image for EVE Online. And now we need to do Mount Olympus on Mars, which is like like the biggest mountain in the solar system. Like it just needs to be a lot more challenging and a lot bigger. But it doesn't mean that you're removing all the gradient from the top down to the bottom. So I hope by just like making the difficulty mountain taller and the gradient in the beginning a little milder, we will get everyone into what we call flow state in game design, where you are kind of in your sort of skill versus challenge ratio. And it's more about that. It's not like raining chaos on all of EVE Online. It is about like making parts of EVE Online extremely challenging. And then people pick that rim and they live in a risk-reward dynamic as a result.
And also, to Hilmar's point, the stagnation sometimes also just makes people more risk-averse than they are in their natural habitat. By shaking things up, they see that we are shaking things up. And I mean, EVE players in general are hardcore, and I'm sure they will adapt to the chaos as well. And the second point is we are also just seeing the players coming back because of these chaotic changes, because EVE players seem to love chaos.
That's interesting. The risk averse thing that you just brought up. I saw a video where if you ask somebody, I'll give you $10 if I flip the coin and you actually call what it is, heads or tails. And if you lose, I'll take only $1. That people still wouldn't take that bet because it's a one-time event and they feel like it's too risky. But if you say we'll do it 100 times, they're totally willing to do that 100 times, because the frequency of it happening 100 times means they'll get a chance at least to win a few times, and that gets them to go over that risk aversion. And so I wonder if all this chaos does the same thing, in that there's so many people dying that you won't be humiliated or lose really badly because there's just so many things going on. Everybody's losing, and therefore it's okay to lose.
Interesting that you bring up this example, because what you're describing is the human learning loop. Like humans learn the most from failure, and if anyone has gotten anywhere in EVE Online, it's mostly through failure. And if you have a one-time experiment which has a failure state, and there is no follow-on, there's nothing to learn. Like you cannot master it. And obviously random coin tosses you cannot master. But still, the learning loop of a human isn't sophisticated enough that if we see a pattern, we try to learn it, even if we know it's random. So that's why like people would do it if you offer multiple chances, because extremely instinctually we think, okay, I will be able to master it through trial and error until I do. And if you end up in a state with EVE Online where people have mastered theirs so well that there is no failure state left, there's nothing left to learn, and thus EVE Online is no longer engaging. If EVE Online introduces a heightened failure state, like making the difficulty mountain taller, there are more ways for people to fail, which are currently only succeeding. And if you're only succeeding, you just become bored. Nobody likes a win button. Press this button and win. You just lose interest and you leave. So you need to introduce elements for people to be able to fail. Otherwise, you don't learn. If you're not learning, you won't play any computer game or any puzzle or anything. Usually, all games, it's a fundamental mammalian instinct to play to learn. All mammals operate like that, and as do we.
I love how that works, but it is incredibly interesting that another book that I read not long ago was I think it was called The Attention Merchants by Wu, I think professor from Princeton, talking about how people work to gather our attention and how that's evolved from radio all the way up into the internet. And one of the things he talks about was video games in the arcades and how those popped up, and that people played this incredibly tough game called Space Invaders. And the tougher it was, the more quarters they would put into that thing. And it ended up making billions. I believe it was billions. But anyway, more than the films that were being released that summer, like I think Jaws or whatever. So it was a blockbuster success, and it was incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Omar.
EVE Online is closing in on 1 billion, and getting to 1 billion is going to involve making it harder for veterans and easier for noobs.
Closing in on 1 billion. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
We'll just leave that there. Falcon, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, just when we were talking about sort of the state of things in terms of difficulty, and when we're talking about the blackout in particular, I mean, it's pretty evident what Hilmar was saying when you look at activity since the blackout started. I mean, yes, the monthly economic report for July and probably into August as well is going to look very bizarre, because there's certain metrics that are going to change drastically based on player activity. But it's interesting that even when you separate out sort of the daily login event that we've had around the claim and skill points, and then obviously the other stuff in the season of skills as well, that's just started today with the claim and NPC bounty skill based stuff. It's incredible to see when you separate that out that the activity is still there. We've seen things like the ISK faucet from bounties drop drastically because people are like, oh, I don't want to go in my anomalies if I can't see what's in local, and I'm scared because there's recon ships out there that aren't going to appear on D-scan, and I don't know whether I'm going to get jumped in my expensive ship. But guess what? Shit's still blowing up. People are still jumping through Stargates. Things are still happening. Ships are still dying. Things are still being mined. Resources are still flowing, and it's not the end of the world. The activity is still there. It's just the activity has shifted, and people are moving on to doing different things, and they're adapting and they're trying new things. And if we can sort of like shake the sandbox up a little bit and get people to try new things and try and realize that, hey, that risk adversity doesn't necessarily need to prevent you from trying out new things in EVE, then I think it's a good thing for everyone. It exposes people to different types of gameplay. It exposes people to more risk. And for me, even 13 days in, I mean, I'm a bit biased as a veteran of EVE, but 13 days into the blackout, I'd say so far it's been an enormous success, and I'm very happy looking at metrics to see how things have gone. So yeah, it's produced some very, very interesting results so far, and it's nowhere near over. So it's going to be interesting to see how it goes.
How long do you think it'll take to stabilize based on our current trajectory? Not turned off or anything, just stabilize where the players have their head around what to do.
It's hard to run that simulation based on just 13 days of data. Yeah. And we're also kind of in summer, and there's also a lot of other things going on. So there won't really just be this one event to deal with. There will be a lot of things going on. So while you might try to draw some trajectory onto stability based on 13 days, then there's just going to be a lot of different things happening in the coming weeks, which are going to destabilize the system further. So people will have constantly new things to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, you've also got to get a handle on what do you mean by stability? I mean, do you mean DAU? Do you mean CCU? Do you mean stable MAU? Do you mean activity in the game in terms of people getting out and doing stuff? It's really, I mean, for nearly 17 years now, EVE has always been treading new ground. I mean, there's no game that has a similar sort of economy. There's no title out there that has similar sorts of player interactions where everyone's in the same environment, utilizing the same resources. So it's kind of unprecedented, and we're always treading new ground when we do stuff like this. So it is really difficult to predict things. I mean, you can predict player behavior, but you can never predict how things are going to go beyond sort of like beyond kind of making an educated guess. So it's for me, it's a very, very interesting social experiment.
Yeah, it's definitely a social, like you guys were saying, that it's hard to figure out what's going to happen, and that you guys, in a way, kind of gave up trying to extrapolate all human behavior. But the players of EVE Online actually kind of do the same thing. So a lot of the players have been saying, "Oh, what do you think? What do you think their end result is going to be?" Blah blah blah. And it's so funny to hear CCP Falcon say that the metrics are saying that people are still out in space, because from the in my like sphere of influence, I guess, it seemed like a lot of players, when the nullsec blackout happened, and then zKillboard turned everything off, and then Dauntland turned everything off, they were like, oh shit, what do we do? And so they were kind of like looking side to side, looking to their peers to see what their peers were doing. And then eventually they were just like, you know what, screw it. Like, I don't want to be sitting here in limbo. I'm going to be the guy that goes out and makes that money. And then kind of their peers started saying, oh shit, okay, well, he's doing it, I'll do it too. And it does kind of feel like we're entering that stage where people are kind of getting off the pot a little bit and kind of putting their foot in the deep end just to see what would happen. I guess one of my main questions is, I was chatting with CCP Burger, who is incredibly fascinating. If you ever go to an EVE meet and CCP Burger is there, I suggest you get him a beer and talk to him for a little bit. But he was saying, what my background is in hardware, and when you make a mistake in hardware, things like completely break and explode. So moving to a software environment, he just eked out at the idea of being able to try new stuff. And he's like, well, the worst case that happens is we get to see like the effects of it. Like nothing fundamentally breaks, nothing explodes. And I was wondering, is that sort of the mindset that you guys have going into this whole chaos era thing?
The mindset is definitely just acting more and thinking less. It doesn't mean that we're not going to think anything through, but it's more valuable to make a change and track the impact it's having, rather than try to go into your sort of Asperger mind and try to extrapolate all the moving variables until the cows come home. And there is just a mode of managing things. So, and I'm not really sort of criticizing per se what we have done in the past. It's not like what we were doing before was all bad, and like it's nothing like that. It's just, it feels like now is the time for this. Now is the time for a chaos era, and the chaos era involves a lot of experimentation. It involves a lot of changes. It involves a lot of frequency, much more rapid fire action from CCP than you're used to. Ideally, something should be changing every week. Some of them are big swathing changes. Some of them will be wildly unpopular. Some of them will be wildly popularistic, unpopular, but popular behind the scenes. Like it's going to be any which way of this. And we have just we've done little of that in the past years, but now we're going to do more, and that's going to bring about a different state. But I very strongly believe that is what EVE needs right now. And then we just sort of move through it as we move through it all together as we have, and we will end up hopefully 18 months from now in a place which is a much more exciting and dynamic place than what we were in at the beginning of the year.
And I mean, we are closely monitoring what is happening. It's not like we're running around turning screws and then running to the next one and just being blind. These are calculated risks that we are watching.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, sort of during my slight Reddit rampage earlier in the week, I've been of the firm view for a long time that the meta in EVE, nullsec, lowsec, and highsec, just all over the map, needs a really, really good kick in the ass to get things moving again, to get people driven into conflict. I feel like people have sort of, they've built their castles and they're happy to sit behind the walls under the protection of a moat and just say, this is my stuff, this is where I'm staying, kind of fuck the rest of you guys, like this is my empire. And like I want us to be in a position where we can promote conflict. And the way that I've been looking at it is, I mean, obviously, no one knows everything about EVE. There's no one that has the all-seeing eye. But when I've been thinking about suggestions of what we could do to shake the box up, I've just been sort of listing something, thinking about a problem that we have, thinking about a solution, 3 bullet points that are pros, 3 bullet points that are cons. And if the pros outweigh the cons, I'm thinking, yep, I'm going to float this as an idea and we'll see what happens. And then, as both Hilma Hilmar and Goodfellow have said, like we're looking at things super carefully, and everyone's constantly got their eye on metrics. We're constantly looking at how players are reacting to the changes that are being made, and there's no saying that we couldn't go back and tweak things if we feel that we've overstepped something, or if we feel that we've impacted the meta in a way that we don't feel is positive in nature. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that sort of I'm in the same ballpark as Hilmar. I hope is in like 12 to 18 months we've got a chaos-ridden, hellscape of lunatics that they're all having fun together and blowing shit up. I mean, it'll be wonderful to see EVE go back to sort of the 2007 to the 2009 era. So many games right now are focusing on, hey, we're going to release a classic version of our title product, and I'm firmly of the view that we don't need an EVE Classic or an EVE 2. We have an incredible game with unbelievable cornerstones, a fantastic community, and we just need to make the right set of changes that are going to drive it back into a golden era of glorious carnage again. And that's all we need. We just need a few tweaks here, a few changes there, and we'll be in a position where EVE's just kicking ass again, and it's at the front page of every news site because you guys are doing crazy fun shit. That's the objective, in my eyes at least.
I'd just like to comment a little bit on what both Falcon and Hilmar has pointed out, and pointing back to the old days, whether or not people, or especially in CCP, are aware of how the things changed in the unmentionable year, that suddenly it feels as if we shifted from where organizations were actively trying to get more warm hands into their corporations to actually work, because the new player had extremely high value because of the resource system. But now, because of the new resource system, especially things like anomalies, you can laterally just extend with alt accounts and multi-boxing, and the value of the individual player has dropped, right? So now it's the individual new player that has to try to get into the big organizations instead of the other way around. Back in the day, we used to compete for new players because they had such a high value. I'm just thinking back when we struggled, but when the game was really growing, because new players had an actual value.
Yes, absolutely. You are in a way describing a situation which people are worried about in reality. So is AI and robots going to take our jobs? Yes, it happened in EVE Online, and it happened the way you described it. The work of humans has been devalued against the work of robots and power tool playing, like you were describing. And this needs to be adjusted such that the work of humans in EVE Online has a higher value than the work of robots. And that has a lot to do with what I was saying before, the difficulty mountain, because the best way to make work for humans is to make real puzzle-solving, creativity-based social work, rather than work for robot. This monotonous, predictable, maybe low reward and low risk. But if you can automate it and you can do it at scale, then you can gain a lot. And EVE Online, unfortunately, just is in a place where this balance is off.
Just a small follow-up, because I don't know if people are aware that in many other games out there, there's a lot of attempts to design AI or algorithms around this. But EVE is in a very unique position where it's got enough capacity to actually pull out a lot of those training wheels when it comes to these things. So again, trusting the simulation, because then botting and AIs, whether it's AIs from players, in the case of botting, which is illegal, or in the case of an algorithm from CCP, these will all be broken potentially unless they're extremely high-end, right? But if it's player versus player activity without any of those training wheels, you can't really game it. You can't predict which mooning platform is going to be attacked. You can't predict which field is going to be fallowed. All of these things are unpredictable if it's players doing it.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. I have no argument. You're almost sprouting out the design principles of EVE Online. So,
thank you.
He's been here a while.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask is there was, again, this whole blackout, I assume as part of the chaos theory, is that information went away, right? No people in local. But one of the bigger things that was more disruptive was actually the effect that turning off the third-party calculators, we'll call them, websites that give you information about EVE Online, went off as well in solidarity with what you were up to. One of the main ones was .land, but also zKillboard, which shows you how many kills your fleet is doing almost real time. And I heard that was more disruptive than actually not knowing who was in the same system with you. Does that tell you something about the nature of how much information you're giving out that players can use to have advantage when they're fighting?
Yeah, I think again, when I said cruel but fair is the rim number 2 in the EVE hierarchy of needs, is that in some ways the game is not fair because some people have made an industry out of the data we provide. And some people have even closed them off and have their own special sauce to build protection through sort of IT prowess, for lack of a better word. I thought it was amazingly inspiring that these sites were playing along with the blackout. Speaking of things you wouldn't expect, as we were talking about before, I did not expect that, and it warmed my heart when I saw that sort of spontaneously happen. And also, it did surprise me how much those sites play a part in the OPSEC environment we have today. And I think that is something we need to look into. How do we sort of limit some of that perfect visibility? Because there is, if you just think about warfare in the future, there would always be ways to obfuscate what you're doing. Man would come up with ways to be more covert than what these things allow for. Nobody has perfect information like this in any warfare. So there is something that needs to be addressed there too.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It was just for the record, we had no idea that both Squiz and Wallari were going to turn off .lan and zkill. Squiz actually came to me, I think, 36 hours before he was going to do it, and he was like, by the way, zkill's going to go offline for the first weekend. And I'm like, that's super awesome, it's really nice. But on the topic of intelligence tools and how much we expose, I mean, I think this blackout has really, at least for me personally, it's highlighted the fact that, guess what, you don't need to have an unquestionable intelligence source in EVE to be able to have fun. I mean, I'd love to see us be in the position where, intelligence brokering and intelligence gathering was an actual career in EVE, where you could make money out of it, and it was a skill set that you could acquire, like a diplomat or a fleet commander, where you could be an actual intelligence specialist. I'd love to see a world where there was no local, where you didn't get information on what 2 jumps out, and you actually had to have people who were specialized in gathering information, brokering intelligence, finding out where a hostile alliance is starting to build up a cap fleet somewhere, being able to actually also hide your tracks. I mean, this goes back right through the history of modern warfare, where before the Allies invaded Europe, they were putting big piles of inflatable tanks and aircraft in fields to try and confuse German intelligence. And what's to say in the future there wouldn't be an EVE Online where intelligence gathering was a sport or an actual career, where you would fly a drone into an area of space and find out what's going on, or you would send a probe into an area of space and look to see what hostiles are doing before you went in and invaded. I think it could be really, really interesting, and I think that we've proven over the course of the last 13 days that it can kind of throw a little bit of chaos into the mix, and it can give people a lot of fun to try and have to think outside of the box when the fog of war descends, and you've got to sort of think about exactly how you're going to approach a situation tactically. It's a really, really refreshing a breath of fresh air, and it's even had me thinking as well. I mean, I went out and I started hunting people for the first time in 6 years, I think. I actually did piracy for the first time since I've come to CCP. Over the course of this blackout, and it's been absolutely incredible. It felt like old EVE again for those fleeting few hours, and it was absolutely fucking incredible. I just enjoyed it. And that's what I'd love to get back to. I'd love to see, dirty old rough around the edges Eve again, where you can have some fun and you've got these awesome stories. So yeah, I'm all for it personally.
Did you ransom anyone?
I actually ransomed 18 people in 13 days, so I'm not doing so bad.
Did you honor your ransoms? That's what I want to know.
Absolutely.
And just when Zekiel went in the blackout, what was the most amazing to me was to see the positive discussion about it online. Like players are really enjoying this new mystery about logging in and roaming around.
Yeah, I mean, to back that up, it was funny that it was unintentional, but both Zekiel and Dotlan turned this around on us, where they turned all these services off, and then the community was sort of like, CCP, why aren't you guys doing this? Like, why didn't you guys do this? Why didn't you turn everything off along with local and like really put us in the dark? And there's I love it how there's always that hardcore element of the community who are like, we're like, whoa, turning local off, this is going to really rustle some jimmies. And then there's this group within the community who are like, no, we want it harder, really, really make us painful, like make this hurt. Like I want to be like bleeding from my ears and my eyes when I'm done with this. And yeah, it's awesome to see that drive, that hardcore element of our community is still there, and that people just, they get kicked in the nuts and they're like, right, I'm standing up, let's do it again. And it's wonderful. It just gives me hope.
But there, Paul is exactly mentioning like a difficulty mountain. There are people that want to go and climb Mount Olympus on Mars. They're tired of Mount Everest, and there are people that just want to walk up the hill. Like the element of Eve is that it is some extent like, okay, it's not tall enough, but it's also too homogeneous. Like there isn't like a natural landscape where you can kind of pick your difficulty rim like that. Some people want to bleed from the eyes and ears. Where is that place in Eve? And okay, maybe it's in wormholes, but still we can go even deeper than that.
And I mean, this is the perfect analogy, right? Because like people are, 50 years ago, climbing Everest was the peak of the pain mountain. But now people die in the queue waiting to take a selfie at the summit. And it's like, oh, this is what it's become. And I think this is a perfect parallel to what Eve has become, where 10 years ago, it was a bastard to take and hold sovereignty. It was terrible. It was grueling. You had to go through all of this stuff. And now you take sovereignty and you can sit down and it's just a fun thing that people have. And there's a super cap umbrella. And once you've got Sov and you're in a really comfortable position, you're doing fine. So yeah, it's almost become like Everest, and now people want to take it one step further. And I think tipping the scales a little bit and messing with people is going from Everest to climbing Mount Olympus on Mars. I think that's a good analogy.
That first weekend, I was one of the people that was surprised that Zekiel board turning off had just as much impact, maybe more, as no local. That happened. I felt that as the weekend progressed. But there's another source of intel that's very powerful that we're not talking about so far, and that is the espionage thing. When people have ears on your comms and are relaying everything going on in your fleet, when they're relaying your targets, when you have people in their comms telling you exactly how many they formed up, who their backup FC is, who their Logi anchor is, that takes a lot out of a fight, in my opinion. You now have to talk to your fleet assuming they can hear everything you're saying. So you can't explain anything to the new bros as you go. You have to just sort of go bark orders cryptically, have them followed slavishly, and just try to and your experienced people know what's going on, and your newbies are lost half the time. Are there any thoughts about making espionage counterplay more supported in Eve?
So with this, you're describing a very human condition of trust and who you fly with and things like that. I think it is hard to build sort of stable system to allow people to organize with perfect trust of other humans at scale. So I think before we start to dabble in those kind of things, we have more sort of fundamental elements in the more basic aspects of Eve. But I would love, like, one of the great thing about Eve is that we offer people tools to achieve social organization at scale. Like we were talking about last time, it was so well described in the book *Sapiens* by Harari, where he describes the unique ability of humans to organize at scale. We have insects, we can organize at scale, but not flexibly. We can have other primates which can organize, but not at scale. And humans can flexibly organize at scale. And that is our ability to build memes, religions, control structures, etc. And that is in a way where we want to keep EVE Online's challenges, and that's to the point we were talking about earlier, that it's an infinitely scalable challenge when you're organizing groups of people against other groups of people. So these kind of aspects, like you're describing, they're not a priority right now. There's just more basic stuff we need to do. But developing some of those aspects of Eve, I think is there is a point in time where we need to get going on those. But for the next, at least for the remainder of this year, you will be seeing us in this, in the Eve hierarchy of needs. It's the physical layer, which is Eve 64, operational stability, new launcher, DirectX 12, these kind of technical foundations. It's the cruel but fair, which we have now been talking about for an hour. Then it's the friendship machine, which we talked about in March, where EVE Online has this amazing ability to generate new friendships. Then it's Esteem, which goes into a lot of these kind of higher end elements where EVE Online is the hardest game in the world. It has the most stories. It has there's a lot of esteem that comes from being an EVE player. And then it's the self-actualization where people transcend themselves and become the best version of themselves, grow up, become better people. I've seen a lot of people go through EVE Online and come out the best version of themselves as a result. And I would love to kind of build it up in a way again, but we need to go to the bottom. Like shore up the technical foundation, shore up cruel but fair, the economy, all these elements we've been talking about. Then harness the friendship machine. Then build out the Esteem layer even more, and then actualization. And then we probably need to go another circle because a whole decade has passed, and now we're setting EVE Online up for the 4th and 5th decade.
Yeah, I mean it's insane just to think. What's happened over the last sort of 16, 17 years. I mean, I'm one of those guys Hilmar's talking around where I started playing EVE at age 18 and I was the quietest guy in the world. And now I can get up on stage in front of thousands of people at FanFest and Vegas and whatnot and be out there and actually speaking publicly. That would have terrified me before I started playing EVE. It's entirely changed who I am as a person. But I think we also, when we're talking about, cruel and fair, and we're talking about the friendship machine, I often fall down on the sort of the more hardcore side of gameplay where I'm like, make everything be horrible, make everything be nasty, murder, death, kill. That generally tends to be my mantra, but we also need to understand as well that some of these friendships also don't come from destroying things, they come from building things together. I mean, perfect example of this was one example that I love to use is ISS back in the day. All they did was run an IPO and put together the most incredible network of stations in the early years of EVE. There's so many positive things that come out of also not taking away intelligence tools and making people guess and not making things crazy and chaotic and hard, but giving people the ability to harness the friendships that they created and giving them the ability to actually to build something together. So while we're definitely looking to make more areas of the game challenging and to really challenge our vets as well, we need to, there needs to be care in other areas of the game as well. There needs to be care on the PvE side of the game, the industrial side of the game too. And I think that everyone agrees that there's areas of the game all over the place that haven't been prioritized for a long time that really need some love. So yeah, it's I think it's looking at EVE as a whole really and looking at a little bit of a renaissance across the board. And while I do tend to stick to the hardcore side of the game purely because of the fact that that's what I enjoy in terms of gaming, there has to be a balance, right? There has to be a cycle of destruction and rejuvenation and those friendships that we're talking about building, and that layer of the Eve hierarchy of needs that's all about the friendship machine needs to be really strong. And some of that strength comes from collaboration, not just blowing the shit out of each other. So it's definitely is a scale, and you've got to look at balancing it really nicely.
Yeah, balance is it's a tricky thing. It's actually funny you say that like you were looking at certain areas of the game. I was talking to Rick Stravex the other day, and he was like just out of his mind excited because Hilmar had tweeted something about, "Oh, I hate warp core stabs," and it just eked him out. It's something that he had loved or something that he had loved to hate for like as long as he's played Eve. And just this one little simple tweet, and it just his world is blown up. And then we were talking to another guy in the faction warfare community, and he was like, "Oh, Hilmar, join my Discord channel! Like, holy shit, what do I do? This is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me in Eve. Maybe like this is going to get some love." And it's just really funny to hear you have a similar take on that. But what I wanted to jump back to really quickly was about the social structures of Eve. For the last, I'd say 4 years or so, it felt like at least the high-end gameplay of Eve was balanced on what kind of I call the complexity creep. Just kind of instead of making ships more powerful or anything, just making you need to have more organizational structure in order to grow. And it kind of led to one of Eve's like unofficial axioms called Malcanis's Law by a player, former CSM Malcanis. And it's kind of the crux of it is the more complex things get, the more the larger groups have an advantage because they have that like human potential there to deal with that complexity. And it kind of seemed like the knockoff effect of the complexity creep, which by all accounts, like if you thought about it as a thought experiment, it would kind of shake things up a lot. It kind of just homogenized a lot of the player base and kind of made them all kind of group up together. Is there a fear that swapping from the complexity creep to the chaos creep, I guess, and pulling that mountain up higher, is there a fear that that's going to have a similar effect, that the players are just going to say, "Oh shit, the world is falling. I need to get to my closest friends and just stay friends forever"? Or do you think that effect was more caused by stagnation than anything else?
So you actually touched upon a thing which was related to what Rick was talking about with the OPSEC and the fleet. So the more tools you give to players to engineer trust amongst people away, the more large-scale impersonal groups you can organize. And you could call it complexity creep, but it actually is more of reducing the need for trust creep through tools. And you can see this in reality. A small startup is more engaging and endearing than a huge conglomerate, because a huge conglomerate relies on control structures and mechanisms and chain of commands and things like that to organize humans at scale. And that becomes very impersonal. And the more tools we give to people to do that, the more you will have this complexity creep you're talking about. So there are ways to force that not to be possible through the environment. Again, we were talking about climbing Mount Everest. Okay, it was originally just done by two people, and now it's an enterprise of getting people with means up to the queue to take a selfie. And we can, through the environment, make it such that you will have to trust people more, because the cost of somebody stabbing you in the back becomes so high that you naturally have to shrink down your trust circle, because you really want the people with you that you can really rely on, because now you're doing something super dangerous. And if somebody isn't either worthy of their trust because he's not good enough, or he is playing for the other side, the devastation is so harsh that you will not take them unless you are really their friends. And that's why this aspect of the friendship machine I was talking about earlier is so important. We've even made, there's even a formula on how you make a friend. It's like proximity, duration, frequency, intensity. It takes about 400 hours to make an acquaintance. It takes about 800 hours to make a certain type of friends. It takes a certain amount of intensity. That's why people that go to war together have accelerated growth in terms of their friendships. And many veterans describe EVE Online to similar effects. So when we get to that moment where we are enhancing the friendship machine, now we're still in the physical and cruel but fair layer. Next up is the friendship machine. There we will start to engineer aspects of the way where trust becomes the fundamental currency it needs to be in EVE. Because what you're describing as this and this effect I've never heard about, it is just the tip of an iceberg that has to do with the fact if you give people tools to engineer trust away, you will leverage the people that are able to create complexity structure where they don't need human relationship to hold them together. And we want EVE to be the game where you will always win through like an insanely tight-knit group that have really built trust together. They will always stand a chance against larger conglomerates because that is what happens in reality. That's why startups disrupt the status quo, because a startup of young kids is able to run circles around old established companies because they have higher amount of trust, faster ability to move, and thus they disrupt the status quo. And when EVE Online does not have these qualities naturally built in, then you will just end up with this stagnation where like people have so much ability to logistify impersonally their mechanisms that you will end up in this where the stagnation, that's how the stagnation sets in.
Is there any kind of balancing that with strangers playing together? Is there anything like new players that are coming? How hard is it for them to get involved?
Yeah, so obviously now we're talking climbing Mount Olympus on Mars. That's where that needs to be the affair. But now if we wheel back to your first year of EVE Online, then obviously we need more ways to create proximity and duration, where people have the ability to meet with strangers in a non-freaky way and do something together, and then, hey, Simon, we're always here flying together. What do you like to do outside of EVE?
Let's take the next step in our relationship.
Exactly. Share a secret, which is usually the milestone in a friendship where you share something personal and secret about yourself. Again, there is an extremely good roadmap on how you make friends, and EVE Online is phenomenally good at it because it's. I mean, still cruel but fair, even if we need to make it crueler but fairer. And the natural instinct in such an environment is to bond together with others. Like people bond together to reign the chaos of the environment. So the fact that EVE is huge, dystopian, you're alone, you're small, the world is enormous, what should you do? That's why you reach out to another person, more so in EVE than in other games, which are just seems like you can play them alone. You get a very distinct feeling in EVE Online that you should not do this alone.
Okay.
And that is extremely intentional.
That's great. We're joined by Ash Jarathi, who's jumped in late. How are you doing, Ash?
I'm doing pretty good. This is pretty awesome.
Great. You wanted to ask a question about Faction War?
Yeah. So all this talk about the friendship machine is super exciting to me. I think that you're correct. EVE has a very unique way to make strangers turn into friends, as you describe. Often I have observed that faction warfare has been one of those really, really good ways to take a new player who's by themselves, who doesn't really know what to do, and give them a low pressure way to get into things like PvP and more risky PvE that allows them to then get sucked up by one of the corps within the militia to go from an individual to a more organized group. So I've always seen faction warfare as being like a really important aspect to EVE for various reasons. And yet recently in a tweet, you suggested that you would be spinning it down. How does faction warfare relate to the friendship machine, and are there plans?
I think I suggested the reverse in a tweet.
Did I misunderstand it then?
You probably did. Probably my communication skills. My English is my second language. In any case, there's no plans to spin it down. I think it is. I think it does serve a purpose, like you're saying. I think it has always, even before we had factional warfare, we had these kind of role play events that were kind of organized by community volunteers, which are kind of the manual version of factional warfare at some point in ancient times, is that it became like this sort of, for lack of a better word, gateway drug into the whole madness of the player politics. So and there's a lot of people inside CCP which are passionate about doing some fixes to factional warfare. And now that I've joined the factional warfare Discord, has become famous and read some of the improvement lists. I think there is a slew of things which are not that complicated to slot in with everything else. And I think it does fit our focus of cleaning up the first 30 days, because I think at the end of your 30 days, you are probably ready for factional warfare. Sort of by day 20, you might be a candidate for that. Sort of on average. Yeah.
I agree. And that makes me very excited. Thank you.
All right. Let's actually talk about the state of New Eden now. We've been talking about it this whole time, but I wanted to bring up, if you haven't seen the previous Hilmar interview with Falcon that happened in March, check it out on talkinginstations.com. And where we were at, when we left it, you said that you're working on some things, and that was the 30-day cleanup, which is basically making the first 30 days of EVE Online for a new player something that needs to be cleaned up and made easier and more confined, so that you have better retention rates. And then there was also major technical foundational work that you were doing, and then there was also addressing some of the economical issues in the game right now. So I'd like to take those three things and go back to them and see what's changed since then. So the first part is cleaning up the first 30 days. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah. So I think the biggest move with cleaning up the first 30 days was the new agency we released in Invasion. While that is probably more your 7 plus 30 days rather than your -2 plus 7 days, which is probably where we need the most amount of cleanup. That was a pretty good step. I think the new agency is a really good tool to discover content in EVE. I think the agency and the activity tracker are some of the best sort of roadmaps of what to do in EVE, which is quite complicated to figure out when you come into the game for the first time. We also did some changes to the new player experience, which actually weren't as successful as the new agency. What we're now focusing on is that, according to our data, there are more people dropping off in character creation and steps leading up to that, which than we thought. There were even some errors in our download on demand configuration, so people were experiencing some defects in the very early minutes if you're on a slow connection. So there's been a lot of cleanup like that. There's been a lot of journey improvement in signups and other things. Like I said earlier in the podcast, then we have about 16,000 people per week that log into EVE for their first time, and these are people that have gone through all the funnel and downloaded and got into the character creator state. We have about 800 people per day that drop out just during character creation. And if you go through the journey, there's a lot of bad UX in that journey, confusing button layouts, false decision making, like we're having you read about spaceships when you're picking a race. When EVE Online, I mean, it doesn't matter what race you are, you can fly any spaceship. It was like reality. Germans can drive Toyotas and Japanese can drive BMWs. So why confuse you by making false decisions? So there's just a lot of these sort of booby traps throughout the early experience, which maybe were fine a decade ago when life was different and all that, but they just aren't fine today. People have very low tolerances for bad UX in the world today, no matter if they're casual or hardcore. you can see people crying about bad UX in all types of games. And EVE just has a lot of those cleanups we need to do. We made some progress, but we'll continue that. It is by far the biggest priority we're working on. And that's just by virtue of the fact. I use the word 16,000 per week, but to give you a sense, last year we got 600,000 people to log into EVE for the first time. And we lose 90% of them in the first 7 days. And we have generally sort of taken the stance that, yeah, those are not worthy for EVE Online. EVE Online is a hardcore game. People are not hardcore enough. But we have just studied it, and it's not the case. We have tried various versions of the MPE, and it just matters a lot. Certain types of new player experiences retain a lot better, and those become productive citizens of New Eden. So there's going to continue to be a big push on that front, on clearing up the first 30 days. So the progress so far has been on these. There's been a lot more user testing done to identify where we need to improve the most. There's been a lot more telemetry added into the journey. There have been some short fixes and ninja fixes added in. We have added sort of fundamental changes like the new agency. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to marry the agency and the activity tracker to just make the loop much clearer to people what is the early sort of treadmill you're on. It's quite difficult in EVE to find the sort of early treadmill you should go on in the game. And we owe it to the 600,000 people that tried to be members of the Friendship Machine last year to just do a better job on introducing that in non-obscure ways. They will do fine after that. They will join Factional Warfare or Brave Newbies Fleet or something and move on. But we just have to shore up that experience a lot. And there is the massive potential for EVE in doing that. The wheel we have to turn there is massive. We can easily get 1 million people per year into EVE and retain half of them.
And just also, we see so many people trying EVE again and again and again. Like so many people really want to play EVE, and we somehow just don't manage to show them the wonders of New Eden.
Yeah, I often take John Smedley, who used to run Sony Online. He tried 11 times to play EVE Online. And finally he got it, and he became like a pretty hardcore EVE player. Came to FanFest 2 times and God knows what. But it took him 11 times over a period of 8 years just to figure out what to do. And that guy makes games for a living, MMOs for a living. Maybe we can soften it down just a little bit in the beginning.
This is why I constantly think that there's something wrong with me, like I'm a masochist or something, because I logged in for the first time and got hooked. I was like, this is just for me. So I worry about my mental state sometimes.
Yeah, but Paul, when you did it, it was so simpler. It was you're right. It was like 30 spaceships. Yeah, it was so easy. Like when I was playing EVE back in the early days, it was that simple. The UI was like 1/10 of what it is now. The complexity, the sprawling madness we have today, it was a kid's game compared to what we have.
Yeah, it was remarkably a lot more brutal, but it was a lot more simple as well. So you could handle the harshness because there wasn't so many choices that you had to make. It was the meta was a lot more simple. So yeah, it really has come a long way, and it's just trying to adapt to those differences and the new challenges that we have now. That's the main hurdle, I think.
It also seems like one of the things that you're wrestling with is the reputation that EVE has now, in addition to the game mechanics itself. It has a reputation that and I'm sure players kind of make this worse by saying, if you're not doing nullsec, you're not doing anything. Like they discount all the other ways of gameplay that are a little more, I should say, shallower water. They say you need to get into the deep end right away. So I wonder if that pressure makes it hard.
So I actually think EVE's reputation is amazing, and it's a massive strength to the game. I mean, we who live on this all day long, we have a certain impression of the reputation, but the reputation is super like positive. It's just like the actual early experience leaves a lot to be desired. So that people come in with the impression based on the reputation, but then they're met with just a lot of confusing things which we need to fix up. And by doing that, I think it's on the reputation that people like Simon are able to pull in 600,000 people to log into the game. It's just based on EVE Online is legendary. It's like the most game ever made. And everyone needs to try it at some point in their life, or you're just not a proper gamer. We just like all those hordes of people which are coming in, we just need to embrace them a little more. Again, life harder for veterans, easier for new players, not the reverse.
Try it. Try it 11 times, you'll get hooked.
12th time. That's something that was told to me recently. There was an article, the Drifter article, when the Drifters invaded recently. PC Gamer put that article out. I think it got 3 times the amount of interest that any other article had that month.
Yeah, exactly. People love reading about EVE Online. If they would love playing it as much as reading about it, if we could make a product out of reading about it. Yes. We tried novels, and okay, they were pretty good, but it's.
I like those. Yeah.
I love those.
And the article on Kotaku about the year-long undercover plot to blow up EVE Online's most notorious space station, to read his title, has like 400,000 reads.
Wow.
Yeah, it's massive. It's huge. It just needs to be a little better in the first 30 days.
Exactly. First 30 days. Okay. Anything else in the first 30 days, guys? Somebody had a question.
Yeah.
On the topic of the agency itself actually spun out of the agency events, which were originally pretty wildly popular, but by last February were more controversial. At the same time, the agency drugs are frequently used by abyss runners and others as a means of allowing themselves to push things even further. We haven't gotten any agency events since February, and the Summer of Skills seems to be a replacement for those kinds of events. Is there any plan to get back to something closer to what we had? And if not, what is the future of those drugs?
Yeah, I think there is something in that, in factional warfare and in new fleet roams and in seasons overall, which all gamers by now just know what are. Everyone expects seasons. So I think there is something in this sort of trifecta we need to organize better and make better use of. And we have actually been doing a lot of experiments in the closed beta in China, where we actually have a lot more freedom just to do crazy things because it's a closed beta and it's going to be wiped. And we have actually learned a lot about what really drives engagement in these kind of events. And I'm hoping we can leverage some of that, those findings into bringing some of this back in force.
Awesome.
So the second part of some of the things that you were working on was the technological foundations of EVE Online. What's happened there?
Yeah, so in March, then we had just finished, patching up the chat system, which has held up pretty good. Obviously led to the blackout, and the new launcher. And EVE 64 was a big project, and that has been going amazingly well. The team has done amazing work. The fact that we rolled it out as an optional add-on was ingenious, in my opinion, and that allowed it to kind of shimmer in the natural way, where we could just allow people that wanted to be brave go in and all those things. We are about to roll that out to everyone, but there's still some snags we found out. And again, just such a powerful thing with the optional rollout of it. I hope to do more of that on that front in the future. Then we continue to work on the DirectX 12 client. We have internal version, sort of operational, but it's going to take the remainder of the year to sort of clean out all the stuff that can be cleaned out once we have just made DirectX 12 as the baseline. And then, of course, reaping all the benefits from them, and the benefits are massive. DirectX 12 is super powerful, and there's a lot of different things we can do with that. But that will probably take well into next year of bring all of that about, and hopefully we can do that in an optional rollout as we did with the 64-bit client. Then we're doing a lot of sort of back-end infrastructure improvements. We've been doing massive changes to the combat system on Eve called Dogma. It's actually its own sort of procedural programmatic engine. We've simplified that a lot, which allows us to do some more interesting things and hopefully bring performance, even more performance through that. We're doing some experiments on the networking side, potentially upgrading the protocol transport layer underneath the game massively, which would be a game changer to fleet fights and other things. That is an extremely sort of speculative project. It could be awesome or it could just not work out, but it's something we're pushing on. Then we're upgrading all compilers to Visual Studio 2019, which is a massive project. The Eve code base is like millions, tens of millions of lines. So like doing upgrades like that is a massive amount of upgrading all the middleware, doing all the compiles, upgrading all the linking infrastructure, the dev environments and all those things. That hopefully brings maybe a tiny bit of performance improvement and definitely cleans up the life of developers quite a bit, gives them better tools to develop faster. So there's been a lot going on the tech front. And that is kind of the bottom rim of the Eve hierarchy of needs. And now we believe we're sort of mostly out of the woods there. We don't need as much focus as we needed earlier part of the year. So now we're in the cruel but fair tier, which is this has a lot to do with the null blackout, with the drifters, with ISK faucets and sinks. They're out of whack. There's way too much ISK in the system. Velocity of money is not high enough. There's a lot of fundamental economy problems which we're going to be addressing. So expect a lot of changes on that front coming up. That should actually normalize. It's usually good to look at the Plex prices, because the Plex prices, if it's actually people are often saying like the Plex prices are rising. It's actually what is happening is currency devaluation of ISK, and ISK is the representative of the value of work in EVE Online, and that actually means when the ISK to Plex is falling, then work in EVE Online is not valuable enough. And that goes a lot into the botting issues, what we were talking about, like risk-reward dynamics and nullsec. So we need to push up so that ISK is more valuable, and that's kind of a health indicator of the overall economy, and it's out of whack currently. We both have just an overall out of whack issue, and then we have like a Gini coefficient issue. Some people are too rich. The richest 1% in EVE Online is way too wealthy and way too powerful. It's vastly out of whack. It's worse than reality, and the reality is pretty bad. And that goes into this sort of, as I say, the cruel but fair tier of the Eve hierarchy of needs. So the focus has shifted from the tech infrastructure, which is now, I would say, on rails, and into this. So the later 6 months will be a lot about the economy. Then once we're on that, hopefully we get to enhancing the friendship machine. That then goes into these elements of factional warfare, new fleet finder, agency, social discovery tools, and those kind of things. So there's a lot going on, as you can see.
Yeah. That's fascinating, though, the explanation of the Plex prices actually reflect on the ISK value rather than the other way around.
Yes, it is exactly like that. It's Plex that is anchored. Like Plex is the anchor. It's like gold. In reality, it is ISK which is volatile. It's the Plex prices are not changes. It's the ISK getting devalued. And it's getting devalued because it's too easy to come by, especially for some people that then devalue it against the Plex. They want the Plex because they have so much ISK, because it's so easy to come by. This is the heart of the problem.
And then the people that have a harder time getting ISK have a harder time buying Plex because of the increase of Plex, because of the ease of access of ISK. So like this is like a...
Yeah, it's a vicious circle.
Yes.
It needs to be broken.
So how are you going to break it?
it is taking away the comfort of people that have an easy time of getting ISK, either through actual security, sense of security, or they're just not playing the game because they're having robots do it.
Did the darkness or the blackout affect botters? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it affected botters massively. They were quick to recover, though, but you definitely saw an impact. But more is coming. It's a huge problem, and it's going to get moved on, and their life is going to be very uncomfortable.
They ain't seen nothing yet.
One of the things that I noticed was when the blackout hit, without warning, actually 48-hour warning, maybe a little longer than that because you said you were going to do it, then you gave a 48-hour warning, and then it hit. But it was relatively quick. That it really paralyzed a lot of the income-generating models that had happened before. Not everybody was paralyzed in their Rorqual usage. Players will know what I'm talking about. But they did stop using excavators because they were easy to kill. And that meant that the Rorquals were actually mining a great deal less. So the income generation at least was nerfed dramatically.
I don't feel that it paralyzed anything. People allowed it to paralyze them out of fear of not wanting to take the risk of being out in space when they didn't know what was around them and they had less spatial awareness. I mean, this is something that we spoke about at length internally. I mean, we sort of sat down and were like, what effect is this going to have? And it was no surprise to see people kind of turtle up and say, I'm not going to go out in space. Then we saw exactly what Elise said earlier, what he touched on, where we have people who, the first brave few souls who are risk adverse take the step and they go out and they start hitting NPCs again, they start mining again, and then their friends see them doing it, and slowly things start to open up, more people start to take the risk and get out in space. I mean, it's just one of those things where, when you get pushed outside of your comfort zone, I mean, some people are terrified of heights, right? But you strap them to someone tandem and you say, okay, we're going to go and jump out of an airplane, and they see that it's not that terrifying after they get used to it a little bit, it's more than likely they'll go for round 2 if you ask them, you know what I mean? It's very, it's just pushing people outside of their comfort zone, redefining their comfort zone, and then allowing them to play the game in a different way because they've realized that, things aren't so big and bad when they don't have the spatial awareness that they used to have. And we've seen that in metrics. So it's an interesting lesson in psychology, but it's one that the metrics and the data prove to be very, very true.
And to Elise's point also, and Paul's, if you're not willing to go out, guess what? There's a bunch of other people ready to go out.
And if you're not willing to go out in the nullsec and actually take the risk, then you don't belong in nullsec. You should move back to Empire and you should mine in Empire. Because if you're not willing to be at risk when you're out in a lawless area of space, you don't belong there. If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, it's super tricky. I'm sure it's even trickier for you guys because you have these people who are this huge group of players that are used to making these obscene amounts of money, relatively obscene amounts of money. And, I think everyone's always played a game where they've been the overpowered guy and then they've been nerfed. And that feeling just sours you for weeks and weeks. And you're like, oh, screw these guys. They don't know what they're doing. They're breaking the game. Are you expecting that sort of like visceral reaction to come, or has it like come in past already?
We've already seen that, right? I mean, it's already come. We had immediately when we announced this, 7 days before the blackout happened, we announced that it was going to happen soon. And we saw that knee-jerk reaction where people panicked and they said, I'm quitting. I'm unsubscribing my 50 accounts. Like, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to play your game again, CCP. And then we saw things stabilize immediately after that. We saw, obviously, you get a downturn in activity because people are sort of really, really scared to go out when they don't have the spatial awareness they used to have. But exactly what you said earlier is slowly people warm to it. Slowly people they adjust their comfort zone and they realize that, hey, it's not as frightening as people make it out to be. I'm worried about nothing. and I can actually get out there and I can still make money. It just means that there's potentially the risk that I'm going to end up with a net loss if I do something silly or I get too complacent.
And it does actually feel like I know we were saying, or we were saying, like, we don't need an EVE Classic, right? We can just iterate on EVE that exists. But it does feel like this added element of chaos, the blackout. It does kind of remind you, if you've played the game for a very long time, of the earlier days in EVE Online. And I don't know if it's true for everyone or if it's just me, but I've had dozens and dozens of people that have quit EVE Online over the last 5 or 10 years, and they're coming back saying, hey, like, I'm playing for the weekend. This is really fun. Like, let's go on roams. Let's do this. And it does seem like the blackout has caused a trickle-on effect of a lot of older players returning. Is that something you guys are seeing, or is that just me being an old man with like 10 years of Steam friends lists?
No, we definitely see it in our data. And I think it's often interesting with this classic thing. I always ask people, what are you looking for in the classic? Are you looking for like retro graphics? Are you looking for old UX? Are you looking for nostalgia? Are you looking for a sense of exploration and wonder? Are you looking for something more dangerous? And usually people don't really know, or they're one of the above or all of the above. So I have not been a big fan of making an EVE Classic like some MMOs have done, because I think what needs to happen for EVE is good for everyone. I don't think we have this sort of traditionalist group that just wants it like this. I frankly think, if you look at some of the MMOs which have gone the classic route, they end up with very bifurcated audience segments in them. And I think that is a bit of a cop-out from building an ecosystem that can allow for all of these things to coexist. So in a bit of the sort of single shard mantra, it is more just about like designing the difficulty Monty such that you can find your rim where you want to exist. And when you're talking about EVE players that have left and are now coming back, they are coming. They did leave because they had just climbed Mount Everest 20 times. Why would you go there 21 times? It's just like, what's new? You've done it the normal road, the North Face, without oxygen, without pants. Like, what's left to do? And now we just kind of added a little mountain on top of a mountain. It's not quite Mount Olympus yet, but hopefully it will become there. And thus, people are excited to come back because it has that sense of challenge, sense of uncertainty, sense of mastery, sense of learning, growing, failing, succeeding, which we were kind of at the final stages of losing. Because the stability was so high. It was turning into the purple donut, as I now call it, apparently.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying then, and what's been said earlier when we've been discussing like what EVE really is. I mean, it's great for other MMOs to come out with sort of the classic and the retro versions, but I mean, for me, there'll only ever be one EVE. For me, that's the way that I see it. It's single shard, it's persistent. That's the way that it runs. But it's yeah, I mean, you can find different levels of comfort, right? You can find different levels of difficulty, and you can find different levels of whatever type of gameplay that you want in EVE just by visiting different areas of space. I mean, there are so many games within a game when you play EVE. I mean, you can dive into PvE, you can dive into PvP, you can dive into doing planetary interaction, you can just go complete the industrialist route, you can go the complete diplomat route. You don't even need to undock to make billions in the game. And it's it's one of those beautiful things where if we keep adding, we keep tweaking, we keep playing around with it. And in a sense, sometimes looking backwards and seeing what worked in the past, you can always find a place to create EVE Classic for all those people who want it without even having to launch a new game or a new server or a new version of the game. EVE constantly adapts. And I think it's always going to ebb and flow and go through these states of change where things sort of like quieten down and stagnate, then build again. And I mean, we see this year on year. We see the build up in the winter, then the lull during the summer, then the build up again. And anyone who's a CEO in EVE will know that it's an absolute nightmare keeping a corporation or an alliance active over the course of the summer. That's just the way that it is. I used to dread it every year for 10 years when I ran my own corporation, because you would run into this brick wall at like sort of the end of May, where it's like, bye guys, I'm off on vacation. And you would find that fleet commanders, directors, that kind of stuff would go AFK. So I think it's just a matter of looking at the ebb and flow of EVE and looking at what we can do to make sure that it constantly stays vibrant. And I think a lot of the changes that are coming up and a lot of what we've been doing over sort of the last few weeks have spurred a lot of old vets to coming back. I mean, I've seen probably 30 or 40 people personally that I know who have said, oh, fuck me, no local in nullsec. I'm going to come back and sort of poke the bear a little bit and have some fun and see if I can rack up a few kills. Then people log in after 10 years away and they're like, what the hell happened to my Megathron and why can't I fly it anymore? So it's super interesting, you know, and it's and welcoming those vets back with open arms is definitely a good thing.
I have a little bit of a follow-up to that, because one of the things we saw during the blackout was that suddenly CKIL decided to take off their service and make it completely blackout, right? And this ties into one of the things about classical EVE that someone seemed to have forgotten. It's how much perfect knowledge destroys the game. Back in the day, we used to scrape the market so suddenly you could have universal information, and eventually CCP opened it up with the ESI. So we had a very controversial discussion. What would happen if CCP actually decided to delay the ESI? So you could not actually have access to perfect universal knowledge of the market or the kills, because suddenly you have to then put real warm hands back into the game. Someone needs to be in the region to actually see the market. Someone needs to actually be on grid to see the kills being made.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think that having the API is great. Having all these third-party tools is fantastic, and the creativity of the community is absolutely awesome in designing so many awesome, you know, applications for disseminating this information and making it viewable. But I definitely feel, and this is no discredit to either the guys who work on the API or the guys who make the third-party tools in the community, but I'm putting my hardcore hat on again, and I feel like we spoon feed too much information. We give out too much intelligence. I think people should have to work for it. It should be a career in game, and it should be something that as a player you are skilled at doing. You are a skilled intelligence gatherer. You know what matters to an FC. You, as a scout, you know what information people want to give out. And I can remember sort of back in 06, 07, 08 when having you'd be even just roaming through LowSec with a 20-man gang, you were relying on a scout so that, and a tail scout as well behind you to make sure that you weren't going to get caught with your pants down and you weren't going to sit on your own balls because you jumped into another fleet and you got your asses handed to you. And back then it was an incredibly fun thing to act as a scout. I can remember doing it many, many times for a corporation, and it was so much fun. And yeah, I do think it's a contributing factor to that safety umbrella, and it's a contributing factor to why so many people are sort of doing the whole nullsec get rich quick thing, because they just have so much safety. In most instances, working and living in null can be safer than high sec if you're in the right area. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that a lot of intelligence systems should go away.
And just like I said before, with the CKIL blackout, all the discussion online about how some players at least were loving it, at the very least there's something interesting there to look into further.
Right. Another thing that comes up, because we're talking about the massive maldistribution of wealth, some people being super, super rich compared to most players or other players. It seems like the risk has been heightened. The chaos is trying to destabilize the easy money, basically, that I think Falcon was just alluding to. What about asset safety? That seems like a huge change, huge possibility.
I've been very direct around this. I'd completely kill it 100%. It would go away and it would never be a thing ever again. I believe if you put something in space, you work for the you put it down and you put it at risk, it should be at risk of being destroyed. From my point of view, I would have asset safety work exactly the same as if you destroy a ship. Massive loot pinata, and what drops out of it drops out of it. What the loot fairy gives you, she gives you, and what you don't get out of it, you don't get out of it. Just that's the way that I would work it. And I know a lot of people disagree with that. A lot of people think it's too harsh, especially when you've got, in an 80 billion-esque keep star and then potentially trillions of ISK worth of stuff inside of it. But you roll the dice when you live in nullsec. That's the way that it is, and that's exactly how I'd want the game to be.
So players who
it's actually just to kind of build on that. The fact we have NPC stations with endless amount of storage space is a design cop-out from the beginning. Like we had extraordinarily elaborate designs in place, which we had to rip out because of database performance, to limit how much you could store on NPC stations. And there was going to be upkeep, there was going to be like a free slot, and I remember I wrote like acres of code in the market service so that you couldn't use the market as a cheating storage by just keeping everything in your orders as a fake storage space. So this fact that you have, starting with NPC stations, endless amount of free storage space, and now with asset safety in Citadels, where you can just have a billion titles in your Citadel and there's no upkeep, there's nothing. Where are they all? Like, it just doesn't make any physical sense even. It is something we need to tackle. It's not the way the game was meant to be, to allow you to accumulate so many things. There's a lot of elements, like, for example, with the Titans, which don't really fully function. It's like, to have such massive weapons of war, you need fuel to power them. Like, the Germans lost because they were out of fuel. Like, they had massive tanks but no fuel. Like, the fact you can just zip these things around is not natural, and it's not how it should be. Whether it is going as extreme as quickly as Paul is saying, just ripping it out immediately, maybe that's not the approach, but something needs to be done. This is not natural. It causes a lot of misaligned behavior to what EVE should be.
Will it make it harder to encourage old players to come back to the game because they'll have to start all over from scratch?
It will definitely make some things harder. Like, nothing is without a trade-off. But when you're faced with a tough choice and you don't know which way to go, you have to have some principle to guide you. And this is just not how the world works. It's not how EVE is meant to work. Nothing is perfectly safe anywhere. It's just not a thing. It never has been a thing. It's a law of the universe. Whatever belief you hold, nothing is permanent. It's just what it is. Except asset safety and NPC stations in EVE Online is permanent. It's the only permanent thing we know. Not even money in Icelandic banks is safe.
There is that.
So if only you could take your real money and put it in an NPC station, then we'd be on to something.
Exactly. Now there's a business model. Come and store your assets in EVE Online. They're safe forever.
Sure, with all the work you're doing with blockchain or looking at blockchain as models and stuff, maybe there's something there.
Maybe there's something there. We're onto something. We certainly have a better operating record than Icelandic banks, for example.
Right, and you have Ghost to enforce things if need be.
Indeed, we have Ghost.
So there's something though. You've been looking at. I mean. Every time I talk to you, I'm just fascinated with the stuff that you're looking at. And one of the things is blockchain and how they organize themselves. And you were thinking at some point, not anytime soon, but you would take some of those principles and relate them to the marketplace of EVE Online and give it more complexity.
Yes. So I love tracking blockchain. I've been doing it for a decade. And my hobby is going to blockchain game conferences. There you find some of the best economy thinking in all of the game industry. because the constraint of the blockchain is so high, there's so little you can use it for, that people come with such elaborate theories, and people have built such amazing technology like the Lightning Network for Bitcoin and all the sidechain solutions for Ethereum and all that. It's fascinating to see the economic prowess that are brought to bear to try to make this useful for something in its current form. Because just to give you a sense, like the DAU of EVE Online is more than all of blockchain combined. Like if you look at the DAU on Ethereum and Bitcoin, EVE Online has higher daily active usage than all blockchain industry combined. And it's mainly just because if you were to put something like EVE Online on a blockchain, the earth would melt. There isn't enough power in the universe to power that. But because of those constraints, they have to chisel their thinking so sharply and really boil it down to the essential. I find some of the sharpest economy thinkers are at gaming blockchain conferences, which is an actual niche. And they have many of them, and I love going there and just being inspired. A lot of them reference EVE Online as the first blockchain game that didn't use a blockchain. Everyone wants to build some version of EVE Online, and then that's the extent of their imagination, like sort of creativity, but their extent of their implementation prowess are immense because the constraints are so high. You have to be so precise in what you do.
Yeah, one of the things that attracted me to EVE Online was how complex the economy could get. And it felt like that was a whole half of the game. The other part was the vampiric PvP.
Yeah.
One last question. This is the last question, and then we'll wrap up. There was an article that came out, I think it was Polygon, where you talked about some of the technology underpinnings of EVE Online and how, if in the future, and this is an if, you needed to migrate all of EVE players onto new technology, that you could do it in some way through story. And I hope this is accurate. And that means like maybe some kind of voyage that like New Eden was created by a pilgrimage from our current solar system. And it might look like, for instance, a second pilgrimage out of New Eden on into a new space. And that transition in the lore and in the game would actually be underpinned by changes in technology. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it sounds very accurate. It's totally something I would say, at least. So, I mean, you are watching us now do experiments, for example, with Ether Wars on the Harian engine, which is a kind of a research spike in what is a very different way to do a space game in the modern era. And you've also seen us do something like in Abyssal Dead Space. We actually have changed the camera angle, like flight dynamics. We've done a lot of experimentation on that front. And I hope that we will do more of these kind of spikes into different directions. And I would encourage everyone to join the next beat in the EVE Ether Wars story, which is happening around Gamescom. We've kind of taken Etherverse into the abyss. You kind of see it when you watch the trailer, and it's going somewhere. Out of that, I hope we will learn something about like what is a way to address some of the fundamental issues in EVE fleet fights. Has to do with the fact that the combat system is mostly one-dimensional. When you look at it, the reason why people blob up as they do into two balls is because that is the mathematical solution to the underlying fundamentals of the physics engine of EVE. As soon as you have introduced elements like line of sight and orientation of spaceships, you naturally create formations, flanks, and all the sort of systems of large-scale warfare, where not only they're naturally happening, you don't have to game design it, but also they're immediately comprehensible to other humans. You understand why the big ships are in front of the small ships. You understand why protecting the flank is an issue, because those ships can't turn very quickly and they're weak on the left side and not the right side. And to do this in our current physics engine would be major surgery and probably not even worth it. But doing this in Ether engine is quite doable. And then you've fundamentally changed the potential of warfare, not only from a lag perspective and things like that, but also from tactics and then it's just become so much more engaging than the current one-dimensional system, which is mostly a function of distance and fall off and just what we have to play with at that scale. Then once you have done that, then okay, how do you introduce that into the world where you cannot just completely rip all the muscle memory away from people? People have trained to do fleet fights for 16 years. It's not like just turning off local. It's a little more fundamental than that. It's embedded into your nervous system. Then you have to make a migrating pattern over to this new technology platform. And then it's not a hard imagine to make. Okay, if people are able to migrate in New Eden in the first place, why can't they migrate somewhere else? Well, the wormhole that opened up, when that open up again? Maybe there were other people from Earth that went another way because another wormhole has opened, because timeline on Earth, the Terrans are still there, they're up to something. Maybe another wormhole has opened and that had led to somewhere else. So there are just so many dynamics to how you could roll this out once we have executed all that. And that's one of the things we're now allowing ourselves, is just to take these like insanely long leading projects like this Ether War thing, which will lead somewhere. We're not entirely sure why or if it's going to work out, and that's why we're recruiting EVE players to join us along for the journey. Once we have pieced together all these things, shore up some of the fundamentals for fixing this year's in EVE itself, then you can imagine a much more exciting world where you have these kind of multi-dimensional versions of the game kind of coexisting in one social economy.
Yep, it's super exciting stuff, and just got to do the dirty community guy plug for Ether Wars actually, because I was super surprised at how many people signed up first time around for the first test, and it warmed my cold dead heart to see so many EVE players embrace it and really want to become part of it. So for everyone who's going to be listening, you should definitely sign up for Phase 2. It's happening on the 18th of August at 1300 EDT, so 1700 UTC, 1800 BST. And you need to sign up for it, so you can go to Hadean.com/EVEtherwars and just sign up with your email address that you use for EVE Online, so your verified email address. And yeah, come and be part of it, because while it's something that's still in the super early sort of exploratory phases, it's very exciting. And it could do a lot for the future stability and the future technological advancement of EVE. So something that's very, very exciting for us.
This is for the future of EVE, and like it's still very much a demo, but the build is looking super cool also. Like it's amazing what the guys are doing.
Also, the aim is for 10,000 players in a single fight, and just saying, but if we get more than 6,142, I think it is, then we'll break a Guinness World Record again, and who doesn't want to be part of that?
Yeah, breaking our own world record, or your world record.
Well, that's something we'll look forward to. Thank you guys very much for this exciting 2 hours of conversation. Totally blown away by some of the stuff that I heard today. It's always surprising that even after playing this game for more than a decade and nonstop, that there's still things to learn. Okay, so I want to say thank you to Hilmar for joining us with CCP Falcon and CCP Goodfella. Thank you guys very much. And Ashtarothi, Caleb, Carneros, and Elise, thanks guys for being here with me. And I also want to thank McLeod for putting the engineering together. That's all that we have time for this time. So we will see you next time on Talking in Stations.